this work is, I might acknowledge many other people contributing to this work, lots of colleagues from CSIRO, Paul Ryan, who I'm sure many of you know, SOPAC, many state government agencies, NRM groups and NGOs we've worked with over this. And the work I'm going to talk about today is comes very much out of two projects we did, one for the National Reserve System, another one more recently for NCARF on climate reservation objectives. Liz sent the links to those two projects around. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way we've gone about assessing the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, and three key results that come from that, and then some implications for the management of biodiversity, and then some implications for how I set objectives for management of it. And in that, I'll touch on this idea of a climate ready, so what it means to be ready for climate change. Okay. So we come to the view that it's useful to think about the impacts of climate change in a couple of different ways. Firstly, to think about the different sorts of ways that biodiversity might respond to climate change. And that's separately from asking the question, how much might biodiversity respond? And, I'll just use a little analogy if I can. So firstly, imagine if you're in a room and turn the air conditioner down really cold. There's different ways you might respond. You might put a jumper on, you might go and get a hot drink, you might leave a room, you might sit there and shiver, you might drop dead, you might nothing. There's lots of different ways you might respond. That's separate from the question of how much did to get turned down or how significant was letting down of that temperature. It's hard to predict whether one's going to put a jumper on as opposed to doing something else, but it might be easier to predict that we'll do something once the temperature drops to a certain level. And so there's a similar sort of approach to biodiversity, using qualitative ecological analyses to look at all different sorts of ways that biodiversity might respond, and then some modelling, and we've chosen some national scale modelling to try and estimate the quantity or how significant the environmental change is. And we've used this term biotically scaled environmental stress, which is a mouthful, I admit, but it's trying to recognise that the environment changing is a stress on biodiversity, and biodiversity may respond in lots of different ways. There in those boxes are the three key messages that come from those two streams of information. Firstly, it's likely that there's going to be a large amount of change. Secondly, there will be lots of different ways in which biodiversity responds. And third, that there's likely to be a lot of spatial variation in both magnitude and the type of change. And then bring these two together, integrate them together. We've done this in lots and lots of stakeholder workshops, do all sorts of ways, and get a whole lot of key messages for planning out of that. So that's the process we use, and you'll see sort of the threads of that as we go. So biodiversity, how much will biodiversity change? We've gone about doing this is to look at patterns across the whole continent in variation in biodiversity, and they're represented by this series of photos here. Changes in vegetation structure. So both in structure and also changes in composition are characterised, recognisable, low, intuitive. As the environment varies across the ground, we expect to see lots of change in composition and structure. And we can measure that change in many ways. And so you can do statistical analyses of how the environment changes in space and how biodiversity changes in terms of composition or the structure of structural classes of vegetation. And then by assessing how biodiversity changes in response to those environmental factors, you can get an idea of which ones are more important. And so the significance of change in a particular environmental variable for diversity. You can add knowledge about which factors are important to construct a model which you can put climate change into, and then it will then tell you how significant that change due to climate change might be for diversity. This is explained in those reports that I talked about. And we did it in a number of different ways. I'll just leap straight to some of the results. This using the method, the similarity modelling method that Simon Ferry has developed, and this is a map of the biotically scaled environmental stress, the measure of how much the significance of environmental change, and then just at 2030 with a couple of different climate change scenarios. And what you can see there is all by 2030, quite a proportion of the country has got quite significant levels of change. The green is, dark green is no change, the dark purple means, you know, a huge amount of environmental change, or significant environmental change. And if we get 70, you see that, you know, the whole continent is effectively likely to experience very high levels of significant environmental change. So first of our key messages is that environmental change will readily be very widespread, fast and significant in biodiversity. The second message is that there's likely to be many different types of ecological change, and you can think of any particular ecosystem you like. Think of all the different ways in which climate change might affect that. Climate change is itself multifactorial. It is temperature and rainfall changes and carbon dioxide and fires and floods and droughts variation. Lots of change in the environment resulting from climate change that can affect organisms, how they grow and respond, how they thrive and breed and die, affect populations, and then how populations interact with each other, and then how ecosystems function. And there's a whole lot of feedbacks you know, that as they go on, so one species can affect another species. Different types of ecological change. Individual species will respond in different ways. There are changes in the interactions between species, distribution, abundance, ecosystem processes are all likely to be affected. And it's hard to predict exactly how, you know, what the individual impacts of biodiversity on biodiversity are likely to be, although we can be clear that there are likely to be large impacts. Animations here which sort of, you know, may illustrate different ways in which species might be affected. As the changes, a population represented by the green circle here may move around the corner, up the hill, into a gully, just with its broad, it may just reshuffle a little bit in response to climate change. That's one way that we would expect some species to respond. Another is that as the climate becomes more favourable elsewhere, we could see populations beginning to expand, spread across the landscape. And as it changes further and becomes less favourable in current areas, you'll see populations disappear or shrink. And the key factor here is the expansion moving into new habitats faster than the rate at which they disappear, or is it slower? And then the species they respond is that as new species come into an area where a new area, they have an impact on the species that are currently there. So it could be the arrival of new species, which is the main factor that determines responses to climate change. So the little examples of how species might respond to climate change, all of them are very likely to occur in different places. You can also think about different ways that ecosystems and whole landscapes might respond to climate change as well. So it could be the changes in the structure, the productivity, function, health, ecosystem services, all these things can change. And again, across landscapes, the mixture of ecosystems and land uses, all of those things can change. So you can't characterise the impacts of climate change on biodiversity just by one or two different phenomena. There's a whole heap of things. Okay. The third is that there's likely to be considerable spatial variation in how the changes and the ecological responses. So because we have a lot of spatial variation in the environment, in ecological processes, biodiversity at the moment, and these factors are likely to affect how climate change occurs. You can see in the picture, east-facing slopes, west-facing slopes, obviously as the temperature increases, those different slopes will be affected in different ways. If drying is occurring, those places that hold moisture longer will be affected differently to those that on ridges and lose water more quickly. The environment is likely to affect how climate change plays out. The modelling that's been done shows that this buffering, if you like, in the landscape can have a effect of reducing the overall impact. Those three messages. Firstly, that environmental change is likely to be very widespread and significant. There's lots of ways in which species and ecosystems could be affected, and a lot of spatial variation. These becomes the problem, the measure of the problem that we're facing for conserving biodiversity in the future. Second one is that it's going to be a little bit tricky, and the third one gives us a little bit of hope about how we might, be able to do management to reduce some of those impacts or reduce loss associated with them. Now, I was here. If anyone would like to ask any questions just about those issues, feel free to do so. Any questions?
Hi, Michael. So I'm this project up, and I guess a key thing in the southern slopes, then at a relatively high latitude compared to here, and also a relatively geographically diverse part of the country. One element of the adaptation is basically the movement of not necessarily across the landscape but across the ridge. And I think a critical component of this on a sort of scale, often talking about movement from potentially a northern slope to a northwesterly facing slope or a southerly aspect. So there's not a huge range, but small shifts in aspect and topography.
Yep.
You got any comments on that? I guess I'm focusing on this particular part of the world. What are the other sort of key drivers? Important.
Yeah, see, likely to be a major factor in this part of the world. You're lucky in that regard. I guess there's a question though, the extent to which that buffering provided by the slopes, the topographic variation, how much buffering will that provide? And so that's really going to be, as the modelling improves and as we observe what happens, it'll be interesting to see. It means on the one hand that some of these may, all of the processes might be accelerated a little bit. So the species we're interested in might be able to survive easily by moving a small way, but then it also means that there's nearby opportunity for other species that we may not be so keen on expanding for them to expand as well. So it can go ways, I guess. I'll find some of that again as we go through. Going to the interest of time, there'll be time at the end to ask more questions. So, are the implications of these three messages for conservation and biodiversity? First is that, to me, it calls into question a bit what the objectives of conservation are. And I'm not going to touch on this now because I'll come back to that second half of the talk later on. The second point is that it deal with this increasing level of uncertainty and develop strategies that are as robust as possible to uncertainty. Effectively, we have a large amount of change and uncertainty in the detail of change. So actually in the future going to know less about biodiversity than we do now. So at the moment we at least know where a population is most likely to survive in the future. That's where it currently is. We know what the current ecosystem is at a place. In the future, we are not going to know those things. We're not going to know where the best place for a species to survive or what type of ecosystem should be in any one place. So the baselines are shifting now. Three different sort of classes of ways of doing management. One is to try to be proactive, to predict what's going to happen and respond. Maybe how much habitat we need for a species. But under climate change, it's hard to do that, and if we don't even know where the habitat will be, it's hard to be, predictive and proactive in that way. We can try and be reactive. We can monitor and respond. We can look where a species may be moving to and protect habitat there. see that we can't fast enough, and so to protect habitat before species started moving. The approach is to, and there's no point doing that if a particular species we choose to monitor is one that happens to go extinct anyway under climate change. So a strategy, is to be trying to do things that work under many different species and under different impact scenarios. And in strategic planning, they're called robust solutions, and will require less information. And so protecting lots of different sorts of habitat around the place is an example of a robust management. You might not know which species will benefit from that habitat, but it's more likely that some will and will, regardless of the particular nature of the impact. The next 2 points, so the third is about recognising that many of the changes are going to happen at landscape scales, and so there's a need to manage the response at that scale. And one way to do that is to increase the amount of habitat that is available for biodiversity. So both 3 and 4 are really about providing habitat. And the things that we can be quite clear about in terms of providing habitat, the guidance, if you like, is that large areas or larger areas, more area, are likely to be better biodiversity and a diversity of habitat. And in fact, this highlights the comprehensiveness and representativeness criteria from the CAR criteria that we're all familiar with, used in the National Reserve System and other planning activities. Those particular strategies are likely to be one of these robust strategies. We've done analyses that are highlighted in one of the reports that shows that prize in order to achieve a representative protective habitat now, you're likely to continue to have a representative protection of habitat into the future. You want to prioritise in protecting habitat is refuges. So refuges are places that help protect species from variation, from drought, from flood, from fire, from other species, but also those places where the climate may change more slowly, will be more buffered. And the fourth one is about minimising threats. The fifth I've got here is about carefully managing the interaction between biodiversity and other things going on in the landscape. There's lots of other uses in the landscape of land and water, and these will be adapting to climate change at the same time as biodiversity and biodiversity conservation is responding. It could well be that the changes in use and water use from other sectors, from agriculture, from urban use, have an impact on biodiversity than climate change itself. So it's important to have a key eye on the changes. Now, I just pause here to see if there's any questions on those issues before I go into reassessing conservation objectives in more detail.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
That's good. I've gone through the phone line. I've just unmuted everybody, given there's not many of us, so I don't have to go through the hold your hand up thing sort of thing. There's a new at this point.
Keep going. So reassessing conservation objectives. I guess over the recent years, last decade or so, there's been a lot of work on new biodiversity strategies and plans at the national level, states, regions. You've all been through it. And a lot of it's really good, and almost all of it, to some extent, accommodates climate change. Most of it has been looking at the way I do measurement differently under climate change. And very little of it has actually asked the question, does conservation itself, how is that affected by climate change? What does it mean to conserve biodiversity under climate change? Is the very nature of climate change, of conservation, affected by climate change? And that last decade as well, we learned more about biodiversity, how it's likely to be affected, and I've just run through that, and we know that it's likely to be quite significant. And so it raises this question of the fundamental objectives, what conservation is trying to do, how might that be affected by climate change. So we've done a project which is trying to explore that in some detail. This Climate Ready Conservation Objectives project. First thing we did in that is sort of ask the question of how would we know if we had conservation objectives that were climate ready? And we work on that and came up with this criteria, we call it climate ready framing, and I'll talk you through that in a minute. We then come back to current conservation decision making by doing a review of a bunch of existing conservation documents and some detailed case studies with a number of conservation groups from the regional, state and federal level. That was really asking the current approaches to conservation are already climate ready, what would be required to get them to be climate ready, and also testing whether our framing sort of makes sense. Then a number of tools, products out of this, a tool to help people understand what this framing might be, some prototype climate objectives, and then a few lessons, and I'll touch all three of those as we go forward. So these criteria, this climate ready framing, the first element of that is large magnitude of ecological impacts, which I talked about earlier. We saw one maps that show that if you pick any one place, you're likely to, in future, have environments and potentially biodiversity that's quite different. What is for conservation is that, we may have a current state of biodiversity in any one place, may vary around a little bit, but in the future, it's likely to be a different state of biodiversity, and the future conservation task is really one of making sure it ends up in a preferred version of a future state rather than the desirable one, rather than staying in the current state. We can think around staying in the current state as resilience, the change from one to another as inevitable to some extent for a given level of climate change, and then the adaptation or conservation task is to try and reduce loss associated with that change, to end up in a preferred rather than less desirable state. The first of the criteria is coping with large changes in state of biodiversity. Now, the second one is the uncertainty in the detail of change. So rather than, given we don't know what a state's likely to be, so rather than a simple one future state model, we really need to think about dealing with an uncertain trajectory of change, but regardless of the fact that the trajectory of change is uncertain, we don't know which way we're going to go, we can be quite clear we would want to end up in a preferred version of whatever future states happen rather than a less desirable version. And so maybe the task of casting conservation objectives is to try to characterise what preferred means rather than desirable, despite uncertainty about the trajectory of change. Up until this point, it's all been quite ecological and reasonably objective, but now we've got this preferred and undesirable slipping in, which are quite clearly human anchored concepts. We need to think about what preferred and less desirable mean. And so the criteria, it draws on this and says, we need to understand how people experience and value biodiversity, the different dimensions of biodiversity, if we are to know what preferred and less desirable means. One way that is about different dimensions. So quite clearly, people value species. I grew up with the red gum, the Angophora, in my backyard. It's part of me now, even though they don't occur very often in Canberra. When I see one, it makes the hackles on the back of my neck stand up. It's part of me. It means a lot to me. But people also experience and value ecosystems. There's two different ecosystems there in different conditions. I know which one I would rather go canoeing on, have my kids swim. Unless a broader scale, people value whole landscapes, the amount of nature that might be in a landscape. The picture on the left there, Kakadu National Park, a bit of wilderness, that's what we all think about at the end of the spectrum of landscapes. But across landscapes, there's always a balance of nature and people, and the other picture there is of the Murray mouth. And that's a good sort of integrator. It's a way of saying how much natural or human domination has there been over the flow of water down the Murray mouth. So the slopes is a really good example of areas where people seek out that balance between nature and human dominant landscape. So tree changes, people moving from cities where there's a lot of human domination to areas where there's more nature. So that whole landscape is different from the health of an ecosystem, it's different from the species. People do all these things. Now you can appreciate, you can experience all of them, the species, ecosystem, landscapes, all at the same time without going through the intellectual task of teasing them apart. But the reason I think it's important to highlight them is that they're all likely to be affected by climate change in different ways. And in particular, if you're planning management activities, using species as a way of prioritising what you do or where you do it is not in the future less likely to be an effective surrogate for values associated with ecosystems and landscapes. And so maybe the need to think about specifically about species and ecosystems. As well as thinking about species and ecosystems, you can think about just biota and places. So species, the biota, can move around over the landscape. So you can think about conserving a species in one place or another place or another place. You'll think about conserving that species. Or think about a place, you can think about the ecosystem that's at a place, and that ecosystem could change into a different ecosystem. You can get other land uses coming in. You can be focused on a place, or you can be focused on cities. At the moment, we tend to merge them together. In the future, it's going to be increasingly important to be really aware of the difference and maybe concentrate on both rather than merging them together. So that point is a criteria, that climate-ready criteria, is we need to be explicitly incorporate multiple values into this notion of preferred or less desirable for considering future states of biodiversity. So those criteria, climate-ready development strategies would need to accommodate a large magnitude of ecological change, excuse me, considerable uncertainty in the details of ecological change, and impacts on the multiple valued aspects of biodiversity. So to be climate ready, you need to accommodate all of those criteria, but in addition to that, you move away from what I call the static equivalence. So you can't accommodate a large magnitude of ecological change if you're also trying to keep things the same. You considering a large amount of uncertainty if you are managing to only one feature. And you can't really be trying to preserve values associated with different aspects of biodiversity if you're doing all of your prioritisation based on just one aspect of biodiversity. In a sense, there's a paradigm shift here away from to climate ready. Now, we've developed a little button called the climate ready button here to help you remember climate ready framing. This is a triangle. It's a big delta sign. We use delta to indicate change. Sometimes it's big amount of change. It's a bit uncertain. Then on the vertices, the corners of the triangle, put species, ecosystems, and landscapes. Remember the multiple aspects of diversity. So we call that our climate ready button, if you like. Now, any questions? I'll pause again here. Any questions about this climate ready framing? I'll talk you through it a little bit more as we go, but any questions?
There's a lot of background mumble and jumble going on, but I've unmuted everybody. Question?
Yeah, I have one. I'm just wondering if we think it is reasonable to take existing management objectives, things along the lines of, I see a lot of objectives around maintaining current species diversities or extents or whatever it might be, but under that maintaining sort of umbrella, and changing them. Is there going to be a way of just changing the language around these existing ones, or do we really need to go back and rethink and reframe?
That's a great question, and what I'll do is I'll pose that question because the next part of the talk is hopefully going to address that very, very squarely. So it's a bit of both. The language is important, but there does need to be some stepping back to the fundamentals. So you're spot on. Excellent question. you've made this whole webinar worthwhile. Thank you very much. And with that spur, I'll move on. Okay, so applying the climate-ready framing. What's the question? Does this framing, how does it affect conservation? Is it different from what we're currently doing? What if you apply this framing as a test to existing conservation strategies? So in our work, we searched the literature far and wide, and it actually looks like you can go back quite some thousands of years to see various strategies that have been used to protect biodiversity in the face of global catastrophe. And if we just look at the picture here, how does this strategy here stack up against our criteria? Well, firstly, does it cover a large amount of ecological change? Well, the whole globe being covered in water, I think, is a large amount of environmental change, and it did. I was able to cope with that. Second, did it cope with a large amount of uncertainty? They had no idea where they were going to go. They bumped into some land somewhere. I think they coped with a large amount of uncertainty. Cope with seeing values associated with multiple aspects of biodiversity. Well, fowls after their kind, they had birds. And of cattle after their kind, they had mammals. And of creepy things, they had invertebrates as well, which is better than many current conservation strategies. But that's much about some animals. Then they had some plants as well, in nature of plants and food. But there's not much in here about ecosystem health or whole landscape. So, that this strategy was maybe a moderate on the multiple values, but pretty good in terms of the uncertainty and the large amount of change. Now, in our testing, we used some slightly more contemporary documents, 20 different strategies, documents ranging from the international down to the local, and we sort of examined them to try and get a gauge of how climate-ready current conservation strategies might be and to help improve our framing. And also did a number of case studies where we worked much more closely with decision makers, looking at the implications of strategy, of the framing for them, and trying to work out what the barriers might be to adopting this framing. So, some lessons that came from this process. The first was that these three criteria really seemed to be relevant. It was quite clear in many situations that it would go down a path which is different from the status quo and lead to strategies and priorities that were materially different from the current ones. So it was a bit challenging for us at first, and it is that many of the documents we went to and even talking to people, it wasn't particularly clear what their objectives were in terms of what they expected to achieve for biodiversity. So things often had objectives about the acts that were going to be done, vegetating, managing water, whatever it is, but about the actual outcome in terms of biodiversity. And if your desired outcome is minimising change to biodiversity, then you don't really need to spell that out in great detail, and if it's implicit, it probably doesn't matter. But if you are going down this journey, as the question of before raised of how to think about what the different objectives might be, we really do need to be explicit in the future about what the outcomes are and embody them in our objectives. There's a bit of lack of clarity in many of the strategies between what you might think of as the means and ends, the ecological means, the management that you do, and the ends, the reason that you are doing it. So you might vegetate an area, but are you doing that just to vegetate? Are you doing it for a particular species? Are you doing it for species as a whole? What's the sole goal that's achieved by a revegetation or a fencing or a grazing or a water management activity? I think there's a need to constantly check what the means are and what the ends are. And this is part of that going back that we referred to before, about needing to go back to the goals, the social ends, and check that the ecological means are meeting those. Fourth one is that everything we looked at, climate change was recognised as a threat, but very few of the documents we looked at really recognised that it's likely to be a game changer, really change what it means to conserve biodiversity. The widespread use of Concepts related to our three criteria: the large change, the uncertainty, and the multiple values. If you like green shoots, the beginning, there's something promising that could grow into more substantial implementation of our criteria. So there's a beginning of the steps there, but not to the extent that may be required in order to claim your climate ready badge. So resilience, adaptive management, limit to acceptable change are all about variation, but they're not really about substantial changes in the biodiversity. Approach, landscape scale, say that. They're moving away from species. They're about ecosystems and landscapes, but the way they're often expressed in documents and talking to people about, well, we need to manage species by making sure that they have ecosystems to live in. We need to manage species, need to manage ecosystems across the scale of a landscape, which is different from saying, what are the values of a landscape for people, what are the values of an ecosystem for people, and what are the values of a species for people. In summary, I guess it was quite clear that the static paradigm, that the opposite of this climate ready approach, was very well entrenched in a lot of the planning, the decision making we saw. Some of this was very explicit, but it was often implicit as well. And a good example of that is that biota and place are often intimately aligned. A really clear example of that is that I live just across the road, work just across the road from National Herbarium here. As you walk, National Botanic Garden, sorry, as you walk around, there's lots of plants from all over Australia growing at this place. But at the bottom of each one is a label which says what its name is and a map of where it comes from. So this whole idea of where it comes from is intimately entwined as one of the key characteristics of a species. But in future, species are likely to be moving around the place and come other places. This is goes apart is something that is going to be new for us. Okay, threatened species, particularly threatened ecological communities, will use it in a wide variety of documents as a key prioritisation mechanism, but there was some recognition that this is likely to be less effective in the future. These are some lessons we learned. I'll now run through what it might mean to turn these into, what climate ready objectives might look like. Some prototype ones. They're an example of the work of objectives and the nature of them. So a bit like this, there's three elements to each one. So reduce, and then we're going to reduce species extinction, but recognise that the abundance distribution of species are likely to change. So as the abundance and distribution inevitably changes, reduce the extinction of species. For an ecosystem, we want to maintain the health of ecosystems as the type, composition, structure, function of ecosystems change. Recognise that these things in red are likely to happen. We can't stop them happening, but try to maintain ecosystem health as things change. And one is about landscape. So maintaining a balance between human and natural processes in a landscape as ecosystem types and the land and water uses in a landscape. So this last one is a mouthful, but it's a concept that we're all familiar with, but maybe we don't articulate it around very often, and so the language is a bit hard to choose to seen by a landscape. What about a landscape? So at level, these three objectives are reasonably straightforward, but when you start going into the detail of how to reduce the extinction of species if you don't actually know where it's going to be or what an okay abundance is, it's a little bit difficult there. What does ecosystem health actually mean, and how do you measure ecosystem health as type of an ecosystem changing? I said, how do you actually measure the balance between human and natural domination of ecological processes? Some of the concepts get hairy, but I think there's the foundations there of moving towards some climate objectives. They meet criteria. They cope with a large amount of change. They confront with uncertainty, and they are explicitly dealing with the values associated with different aspects of biodiversity. Now, there's an idea of what the future might be, but in terms of embodying these sorts of objectives into our little blue book that tells us what to do, where to plant, or get a climate-ready framing into our heads as mainstreamed in how we think, is quite a challenge. So we've developed a few little tools, hopefully to help people along this way. There's here, it's a series of questions, of guided questions that I won't go through in great detail, but what I say is it deals with our climate-ready framing. It has all three of the criteria in there, and you work your way directly through those end up in the little green box, and that gives you some strategies that we could call climate ready. You might be able to implement them now. So the little box at the bottom is a pathway, represents the passage of time, and if you have arrived at some climate ready objectives, you might be able to implement them now and be pretty confident they're going to work for you through the future. Or you might have to start them sometime. You might not be able to start them now, but you might be able to start them sometime in the future and run with them. Through this tool, you can also identify in these little out loops in red. There might be some things currently doing now which are not climate ready, but you want to keep doing them. So they might be things you're doing in the short term and decide to stop sometime in the future. Or there might be other things that you're doing that don't cope with uncertainty very well, but you want to do them because you haven't got an alternative, but you know you might need to keep adjusting them along the way. And so by looking through the tool, you can sort of work out how you might stack together different sorts of approaches. All that's pretty tricky. You know, there's some difficult questions along the way in doing that, and so I'm just going to summarise now what some challenges and the future information and research needs, you know, in order to develop those pathways and develop future content and objectives. The first is, you guys know this, but fellow researchers need to keep reminding ourselves that adaptation is actually undertaken by people like yourselves in agencies with multiple different incentives and mandates. It's about doing decisions differently. It's about the information needed to make decisions, about the timing of those decisions. And some to the view that building capacity, understanding concepts, ownership of ideas is at least as important, if not more important, than providing blueprints for to manage biodiversity climate change. Okay. The second, and well, I'm sure you'll have experienced that through this talk, is that the concepts and the language are, on the one hand, familiar, on the other hand, a bit challenging in the concept of, in the context of a large amount of climate change. So there's a really big difference between resilience to climate change and resilient to climate change, and yet people to use those two phrases interchangeably. Resilient to climate change would mean that you don't change as the climate does. Resilient to climate change would mean that as the climate change, you change, but you are always resilient. So a system might change from one type to another, but at no point does it become, high fragile. It is always able to recover from a predation, but the baseline gradually shifts. They're different concepts, but it's important to pull that apart and not done well in the current resilience thinking. About species, ecosystems, landscapes, biodiversity, and I may have used those words to a slightly different way to how you think of them. This is a challenge. The point is that in order to develop future objectives, they need to be based on robust concepts that ecologically scientists can describe and understand. They need to reflect this value and need to be able to be written down, codified into legislation, the policy and the strategy easily. So three elements to that. The existence of a species, stopping something going extinct, that's a robust concept. Ecosystem health in a landscape, they're a bit, it's easy to define scientifically, although they clearly reflect social value, but maybe also hard to codify. So there's a significant amount of ecological, social and institutional research that's required to progress these objectives. And something about them in terms of the intersection of a Venn diagram. You need to have objectives that you've got knowledge, you've got the values, and you've got the rules you can codify. There's the intersection, but maybe move that intersection around a bit. And the final point is emphasising that I think more thinking and work needs to be done on ecosystems and landscapes. What aspects of ecosystems and landscapes are valued by people? And this is where the language needs to, or the analysis needs to separate out those values that could cause climate changes and those values that are definitely going to be affected by climate change and maybe. So a special place for you is a type of ecosystem. Maybe that type of ecosystem is going to change and values associated with that type of ecosystem will be lost, but those associated with that place seem to be a healthy ecosystem. And then we might measure and codify and incentivise protect those particular values. That's a summary of sort of some of the challenges that maybe some of you are going to experience through these Stream 1 and Stream 2 planning activities you've got ahead of you. And I'll leave it there and open it up to any final questions. Did that towards answering that question that you had before? I missed your name. Sorry.
Unmute everybody, just hold on. Go on, Marty.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it did. I think one of the things I find interesting about this is the value that people give in some research that I've done before on why people value coastal areas, and they really value the view and, you know, the psychological importance of having a beautiful view of nature and the feeling that that gives people and the positive associations people have with that view. And yet we've often used single species as a draw-in for conservation work, you know, like as a keystone or you know, what I might call it. And I guess it makes me wonder, there must be opportunities to, you know, that people value landscape for view, beauty and those things. Can't leverage off that sort of work for conservation that's more around system processes.
I think you're absolutely right, and this was a message that came to us again and again through that project. And I've constantly racked my brains about, you know, why is it that, you know, some little population of some doomed threatened species can stop huge, you know, multi-million-dollar developments, and I don't really actually care about that. You know, some people obviously do, but it's broader things about the whole landscape really important, and for whatever reason, a view, you know, kind of gets, oh, that's some aesthetic value, that doesn't matter. Whereas this, the threatened species is really important. You know, now to me, the narrative, the societal narrative of what biodiversity is, what loss of biodiversity is, what conservation is, has, you know, gone down a certain route, and I think, you know, in climate change, we really need to step back and reassess that narrative and know that it's coming from value. And I think landscapes and health of ecosystems are absolutely fundamental to that. And certainly isn't going to happen overnight, but and there's bits of work, and as you say, this view and the idea of viewscapes are part of it, but it's pretty tricky. Actually, if you think about landscapes and ecosystems, we on the radio, on the telly, read things where people are advocating for their environmental issue. You can often hear them talk in the heart about the landscape, but then when they start talking about the mechanisms and the legislation they hope is going to help them, it's all about the threatened species, and, you know, suddenly this big disjunct becomes apparent, and you can need for some reform.
Just to let everyone know, I've put everyone on mute just because there was too much sort of scratchy noise in the background. So if you want to ask another question, can you just use the raise your hand function, and I'm looking to see any coming up. We might have to finish up because we've gone a bit over time. Oh, yes, Karen's got a question.
Karen!
Hi, Mike. I was a bit late. I've got I've got lots of questions, but frames are manifest through narrative, but through practice and also in policy, etc. Have you got examples where organisations are actually trying to their institution change so that change frames could be adopted? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I guess it happens. The big one that's happened in society over the last decade is occupational health and safety. The word hive is. Hive has become a fashion item. Okay, that's a complete changing. It's now obviously at the top of our annual performance agreements and all the rest of it. That's a change in framing that was done very, very actively. We scoff at it, but it's an example.
Yeah.
I think another one I would say is connectivity conservation. If that's something where this idea came up that connectivity is important and it became a metaphor. It was a robust ecological concept, or a highly nuanced one and hard to translate into planning. It's a wonderful metaphor and it's something that can be used to how people do things. And so, that's an example. But those little bubbles, the knowledge values rule ones, we here find it really useful to think about how those things interact, that it's about values. And so going and finding out what people value and then looking at the knowledge that's used to describe that and the legislation that connects to the values and how the knowledge is developed to support the rules is always evolving the need. So it's a co-evolution of these things creates the narrative in a way rather than necessarily designing and to. I don't know.
So I think the question you had kind of goes to that. If you can unpack that existing frame is there might be an underlying, genuine intent of doing something quite etc. from which you can build an alternate frame or.
Yeah. Look, I do have a narrative about why we put so much emphasis on threatened species, and it's some people don't like it. I'll test it with you, and the idea is that it's socially robust that the extinction's bad. People can always recognise that extinction is forever. If we have less extinction, that's better. And then it's actually really easy to get knowledge on that. You can have an expert panel which says threatened or not threatened with some criteria which are moderately robust, and you can write rules about that. Where there's a threatened species, you can't interfere. And that has become the dominant tool for protecting the broader, more amorphous concept of biodiversity. And so suddenly the tool is very valuable. The threatened species tool is incredibly valuable. And so people value the tool. They hope that there will be a threatened species in the habitat they want protected, in their landscape. Because if there's a threatened species, then the owner of the threatened species will through legislation or policy or strategy, will then protect these other values. And so there's sort of this surrogacy thing. And so I think a story about why species has become such a part of the narrative of biodiversity in the practice. Value. There's no doubt we value it, but it sort of explains maybe why more emphasis is put on species rather than the others which, do connect to the soul.
Yeah, we can count threatened species. I think it's a measurable factor.
Yeah.